He had only 13 days to get married, or he would lose the entire family fortune. But fate led him to a young woman who had never been touched by anyone. And then, the most powerful man in the family decided to burn everything for her. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. Stay tuned. The scent of incense still lingered in the air when the lawyers opened the will. Alexander Blackwood observed the yellowed pages with the same empty expression he had maintained since his grandfather's funeral 3 days earlier. The hallways of the family mansion echoed with whispers from distant relatives, all waiting for their share of the inheritance that controlled fortunes across 3 continents. But when the notary read the main clause, silence cut through the room like a blade. 13 days. Alexander would have exactly 13 days to marry a woman who met the criteria established by the patriarch, or he would lose absolutely everything. Every property, every bank account, every connection that had guaranteed the Blackwoods' power for generations. The list of requirements was a sentence disguised as tradition: clean bloodline, unblemished reputation, family without public scandals or hereditary diseases. Alexander knew this game. Since childhood, he had known that affection was a luxury his lineage would never allow. His grandfather had shaped every aspect of his education for this moment, preparing him to accept that marriage would be just another commercial transaction, a seal of approval on decades of obscure agreements and calculated alliances. Samantha Rothschild sat in the front row, her blonde hair perfectly arranged, hands crossed over her designer black dress. She smiled discreetly when the eyes of those present turned to her. She was the obvious choice, the ideal candidate everyone expected to see beside Alexander at the altar. Daughter of banker Matthew Rothschild, she had been prepared since adolescence to occupy this position. She spoke 5 languages, understood art and politics, knew exactly when to smile and when to remain silent. But Alexander knew her too well. Behind the angelic beauty and impeccable manners, Samantha hid an unhealthy obsession with him, cultivated over the years. She followed him, with her eyes at every social event, memorized his preferences, studied his habits as if he were an object to be conquered. To Alexander, she represented everything he despised in his world: calculating, predictable, sold to the highest bidder. When the reading ended, Alexander rose without a word. He ignored the protocol greetings, the forced smiles, and the expectant glances. He needed to get out of there, away from the cold corridors that housed portraits of ancestors whose empty eyes seemed to judge him even after death, away from the sharp words that flowed between wineglasses during endless family dinners. That night, locked in his office, Alexander observed the documents scattered across the mahogany desk. Contracts, powers of attorney, property deeds spread across 3 countries. All this represented the empire he had inherited, but also the golden prison that had held him since birth. Each paper carried the weight of generations of men who sacrificed their feelings in the name of a power that, in the end, consumed them completely. In the following days, the pressure increased. Distant uncles called insistently. Lawyers appeared. Without warning, Samantha sent flowers with perfumed cards. Everyone wanted to make sure he would meet the deadline set by the patriarch. The wedding was already being planned in minute detail: the church, the menu, the guest list that included influential names from politics and business. But Alexander felt something rebelling inside him, a voice whispering that there was something beyond those walls, something his grandfather had tried to suffocate with traditions and threats. Perhaps it was just the desperation of a cornered man, but he needed time to think, to breathe away from that environment that had suffocated him since childhood. That's when he decided to flee. In the early hours of the 5th day, Alexander took just 1 suitcase and left for the most isolated family property, a forgotten town in New England. The place had been abandoned for decades, guarded only by an elderly caretaker who looked after the dry orchards and the ruins of an old chapel. It was there that the Blackwoods used to take refuge when they needed to temporarily disappear from the world. The journey lasted hours along winding roads that cut through fog-covered mountains. When he finally arrived, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years: silence. Not the calculated silence of the mansion's corridors, but a true silence filled only by the wind among the trees and the distant song of birds he couldn't even identify. The town was smaller than he, remembered from childhood. Stone houses built centuries ago, narrow streets covered with moss, a fountain in the center of the square that still worked despite years of abandonment. There was something mystical about that place, as if time had stopped decades ago, and nothing from the modern world could penetrate its invisible walls. Alexander settled in the main house, a robust building with thick walls that kept the interior cool even under the strong Atlantic sun. For the first time in years, he slept without being awakened by urgent calls or scheduled meetings. He woke when he wanted, ate when he was hungry, walked through the ruins without destination or schedule to keep. It was on the third day in town that he saw her for the first time. Emily was walking along the dirt road that led to the restored convent, a few miles away. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, her brown hair loose and swaying slightly with her steps. There was something different about her, something that made Alexander stop in the middle of his walk and observe her until she disappeared around the bend in the road. That night, he couldn't get her image out of his mind. It wasn't just her natural beauty, devoid of makeup or artifice. It was the way she moved, as if each gesture were a silent prayer, as if she carried within her a peace that Alexander had never known. Alexander woke to the sound of distant bells. The convent rang the hours with a precision that contrasted with the suspended time of the town. It was still early when he decided to walk along the road that led to the place, driven by a curiosity that he tried to rationalize as simple boredom. But he knew he was lying to himself. The convent revealed itself as an impressive building, carefully restored to preserve its original beauty. Light stone walls contrasted with carefully maintained gardens, where aromatic herbs and wildflowers grew. An ancient fountain decorated the central courtyard, and the sound of running water created an atmosphere of tranquility that Alexander had never experienced. That's when he saw her again. Emily was kneeling in the garden, tending to lavender, seedlings with delicate and precise movements. The concentration on her face revealed an almost sacred dedication to that simple task. When she noticed his presence, she raised her eyes slowly without haste or startlement. Her eyes were brown, deep as ancient wells, and carried a strange familiarity that Alexander couldn't explain. She rose gracefully, wiping her hands on her linen apron, and observed him for a moment that seemed eternal. There was no fear in her gaze, only a serene curiosity that completely disarmed him. "You must be the new guest in town," she said, her low and melodious voice carrying a soft accent that Alexander couldn't identify. "I'm Emily," the sisters asked. "Me to offer you some fresh herbs in case you need them for your meals." Alexander introduced himself only by his first name, instinctively omitting the surname he carried as a burden. There was something in the simplicity of that moment that made him want to be just an ordinary man, without titles or inheritances weighing on his shoulders. Emily nodded and went to fetch a wicker basket, filling it with thyme, rosemary, and other herbs that Alexander didn't even know how to name. While she selected the plants, he observed her discreetly. Her movements had a natural fluidity, as if each gesture were part of an ancestral dance. Her hands were small but strong, marked by work in the soil. So different from the manicured hands of the women he knew in his world. There was in her an authenticity that touched him deeply, a connection with life that he had lost amid power games and appearances. "Do you know these plants well?" asked Alexander, genuinely interested. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen in years. "I grew up learning their secrets. Each one has its personality, its specific care. Thyme is brave, grows even in difficult soils. Lavender calms not only those who smell it, but also the earth around it. Plants teach us a lot about resilience and gentleness." Those words echoed in Alexander's mind with unexpected force. Resilience and gentleness, two qualities he had never managed to reconcile in his own life. In his world, resilience meant hardness, and gentleness was seen as weakness. But there, watching Emily talk about plants as if they were beloved people, he glimpsed a different strength. They walked together through the town, Emily showing him corners he hadn't explored, an ancient staircase that led to a natural viewpoint from where one could see the sea in the distance, ruins of houses that once sheltered entire families, now covered with vines that seemed to embrace the stones with tenderness, a small abandoned church where fragments of medieval frescoes still remained on the peeling walls. "Do you feel it too?" asked Emily, stopping in front of the church. "As if this place holds memories of everyone who has ever passed through here." Alexander nodded, surprised by the accuracy of her observation. He felt exactly that, as if the ancient stones whispered stories of loves, losses, births, and deaths. It was a sensation he had never experienced in the antiseptic environments of his previous life. During the following days, they began to meet regularly, always by chance at least. That's what they told themselves. Emily appeared at the fountain in the square when he passed by on his morning walks. Alexander found excuses to visit the convent, asking about the history of the place or requesting more herbs for cooking. The conversations between them flowed naturally, addressing topics that ranged from the simple philosophy of working the land to the stories Emily heard from the older nuns. She spoke of saints who found God in the contemplation of nature, of mystics who discovered the sacred in the most everyday gestures. For Alexander, accustomed to discussions about profits and strategies, those conversations were like fresh water in a desert. Emily told him she had been raised in the convent since she was very young, after her mother died in circumstances that the nuns preferred not to detail. She had grown up between prayers and manual work, learning to find beauty in simple things and meaning in seemingly minor tasks. She didn't know the world beyond those hills, but possessed an instinctive wisdom that impressed Alexander. "Sometimes, I feel as if my life were a book already written," she confessed one afternoon, as they walked through a grove of century-old apple trees. "The sisters are kind, but I always feel there's something more waiting for me out there, a story that hasn't begun yet." Alexander felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing those words. He also felt as if his life were a predetermined script. But unlike Emily, he knew the outside world all too well, and he knew there was nothing romantically liberating in the reality that awaited him. It was at that moment that he realized the danger he was putting himself in. Each conversation, each exchanged glance, each moment of comfortable silence between them was creating a connection that went far beyond simple attraction. Emily was awakening in him feelings he had believed dead, a capacity to be moved that he thought had been definitively suffocated by years of family conditioning. But there was something else, a disturbing sensation he couldn't ignore. Sometimes when the light hit her face at a certain angle, or when she made some specific expression, Alexander felt an echo of familiarity that bothered him, as if he had already seen those features somewhere else, in another time. That night, alone in the stone house, Alexander looked in the mirror and tried to understand what was happening to him. The man he saw reflected there was not the same one who had arrived in the town a week before. There was a different light in his eyes, a softness that didn't exist when he left New York. Emily was changing something fundamental in him, and that scared him as much as it attracted him. The 8th day arrived with a storm that swept the coast during the entire night. Alexander woke to the sound of rain beating on the wooden windows of the old house, and for the first time since arriving in the town, he felt the real weight of the time that was passing. Only 5 days remained until the final deadline of the will, and in New York he knew that the lawyers were getting desperate trying to locate him. But when he looked out the window and saw Emily running through the rain toward the shelter of the abandoned church, carrying a basket of bread that she would probably take to some needy resident of the town, all thoughts about inheritances and deadlines dissipated. He grabbed a coat and went out to meet her, letting himself get wet by the storm as he hadn't done since childhood. He found her huddled against the church wall, trying to protect the bread from the rain that entered through the openings in the partially collapsed roof. When she saw him, her eyes shone with such pure joy that Alexander felt something contract painfully in his chest. How could someone radiate so much light in a world that he had always considered essentially dark? "You'll get sick if you stay like this," he said, taking off his coat and placing it over her shoulders. The fabric hung too large on her delicate body, but she nestled into it with a sigh of gratitude that made Alexander realize how intimate that gesture was. "I was taking food to Mrs. Julia. She lives alone at the end of town, and with this rain—" Emily stopped in the middle of the sentence, as if suddenly becoming aware of how close they were. The space in the church forced them to be very close to each other, and Alexander could feel the warmth of her body, even through the wet clothes. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable silences they had shared in previous days. It was charged with an electric tension that seemed to echo the sound of thunder outside. Alexander looked at her face, raindrops still glistening on her skin, her lips parted as if about to say something that she couldn't find words to express. It was Emily who broke the moment, moving away slightly and lowering her eyes. "Forgive me, I shouldn't be here alone with you like this. Why not?" The question came out before Alexander could think about it. There was something in the way she had moved away, a guilt that made no sense to him, accustomed to a world where proximity between men and women was calculated only in terms of social advantage. "The sisters taught me that there are temptations we should avoid, moments that can lead us down paths we shouldn't follow." Her voice became even lower, almost a whisper. "And I feel that you awaken in me things that I don't understand." Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Her innocence, the way she spoke of feelings as if they were sins to be confessed, contrasted violently with the cynicism to which he was accustomed. In his world, attraction was currency. Desire was a tool for manipulation. But Emily spoke of it as if it was something sacred and dangerous at the same time. "And what do you feel?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. Emily raised her eyes to him, and Alexander saw in them a vulnerability that completely disarmed him. "I feel as if my heart would race every time you appear, as if the world became more colorful when we're talking. And at night, when I should be praying, I think of you and of things that a woman like me shouldn't think about." Her confession was like a flame that ignited something inside Alexander. He stepped forward instinctively and saw how she didn't back away. Despite her accelerated breathing and slightly trembling hands, there was a courage in her that contrasted with her supposed fragility. "Emily," he said, unable to disguise the intensity in his voice, "you can't imagine what you're doing to me." But before he could say anything more, or do something he might regret, the sound of footsteps in the mud outside made them move apart quickly. It was Father Joseph, the old priest who occasionally visited the town, running to shelter from the rain. The moment dissolved like a soap bubble. Emily adjusted the coat over her shoulders and greeted the priest with a respectful reverence, immediately returning to the role of the devout young woman that Alexander was beginning to realize was only one facet of her personality. But when their eyes met for the last instant before she ran out into the rain, he saw in them a mutual recognition. Something had changed between them, and there was no going back. In the following days, the tension between them became almost palpable. They continued to meet, but now there was a different awareness in each gesture, each word. Alexander noticed how Emily sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence when their eyes met, as if momentarily losing her train of thought. And he himself was surprised several times, observing the curve of her neck when she bent to smell a flower, or the way her lips curved when she smiled. It was during one of those afternoons charged with unspoken tension that Emily asked a question that caught him off guard. "Alexander, do you have family waiting for you in New York?" He hesitated before answering, part of the truth struggling to come out. "I have people who depend on my decisions, responsibilities that I can't ignore forever. And among those responsibilities, is there a woman?" The question was asked with a naturalness that couldn't hide the anxiety behind it. Alexander realized that Emily had been observing him too, trying to understand who he really was beyond the conversations about plants and simple philosophy. "There is a woman that everyone expects me to marry," he finally said, the words coming out like stones that hurt his own throat. "But it's not a matter of love, Emily. It's a matter of obligation." He saw something break in her face, a light going out in her eyes. Emily nodded slowly, as if a suspicion she had secretly carried had been confirmed. "I understand," she said, her voice controlled but not completely hiding the pain. "You belong to a different world than mine. I always knew that. Alexander wanted to correct her, wanted to explain that it wasn't quite like that, but the words didn't come. How could he explain the complexity of his situation without sounding like a rich man complaining about privileges? How could he make her understand that, for the first time in his life, he was considering giving up everything for something he didn't even know if he had the right to want? That night, Alexander walked alone through the deserted streets of the town, the internal conflict growing like a storm. 10 days. That's what remained until the fatal deadline. 10 days to decide between a lifetime of family conditioning and a feeling that frightened him with its intensity. 10 days to choose between the power he had inherited and a woman who had awakened in him a humanity he thought he had lost forever. Samantha Rothschild's arrival in town was preceded by the deep rumble of expensive engines cutting through the ancestral silence of the mountains. Alexander was at the viewpoint when he saw the procession of black cars winding along the narrow road, and he immediately knew that his escape had come to an end. His heart raced, not with fear, but with a deaf rage he hadn't felt in years. She got out of the first vehicle like a queen conquering enemy territory. Even in the rustic environment of the town, Samantha managed to look completely out of place and yet dominant. Her designer white dress contrasted with the ancient stones, her high heels made too much noise on the quiet streets, and the expensive perfume she wore competed with the natural aroma of lavender and thyme that Alexander had learned to associate with peace. "Dear Alexander," she said, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "did you really think you could hide from me forever?" Behind her came two men whom Alexander recognized immediately, Mark Sanders and Joseph Turner, family lawyers who weren't there just to talk. There was something in their posture that suggested they wouldn't take no for an answer. "Samantha," Alexander kept his voice controlled, although every fiber of his body was tense, "you shouldn't have come here." "Oh, but I should have." She walked slowly around him, like a feline studying its prey. 9 days remain, darling. 9 days until you lose everything your family has worked for over generations, and you're here playing peasant in a forgotten town. Alexander noticed that some people were beginning to gather in the square, curious about the arrival of the strangers. Among them, he spotted Emily coming out of the bakery with a package in her hands. When their eyes met, he saw in her an expression of confusion and something that looked like fear. Samantha followed his gaze and smiled in a way that made Alexander's blood freeze. "Huh?" she said, her voice taking on a venomous tone. "So that's it. The little country girl has conquered the heart of the great Alexander Blackwood." She began to walk toward Emily, and Alexander followed her, protective instinct speaking louder than any prudence. Emily remained where she was, her eyes going from Alexander to the elegant woman approaching, with the confidence of someone who always got what she wanted. "You must be my future husband's distraction," said Samantha when she got close enough, for only Emily to hear her. "I imagine he hasn't told you who he really is, has he?" Alexander arrived in time to hear the question and saw how Emily paled slightly. "Samantha, enough." "No, darling. I think your little friend deserves to know the truth." Samantha smiled at Emily with false sweetness. Alexander Blackwood is heir to an empire worth billions of dollars, properties in 3 countries, companies, political connections that reach the top of the government. And in 8 days, he will marry me in a ceremony that will be news across the continent. Emily looked at Alexander, and he saw in her eyes not only surprise, but deep pain. As if all the pieces of a puzzle that had been bothering her had finally fit together in a way that hurt her. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but Samantha continued speaking. "Of course it's true. Do you really think a man like Alexander would waste time in this God-forsaken place if he wasn't running from his responsibilities? He's here having a little fun before taking his place in the real world." "Samantha, shut up." Alexander's voice came out harder than he intended, and he saw Emily take a step back instinctively. "No need to get angry, love." Samantha laughed, but there was an icy anger behind the feigned amusement. "I'm just clarifying the situation. I'm sure Emily understands perfectly what her place is in this story." Emily looked at Alexander for a long moment, as if trying to find in his features the man she had known over the last 2 weeks. Then, slowly she extended to him the coat she still used since the day of the storm. "Thank you for lending it to me," she said, her voice controlled but trembling slightly. "And thank you for showing me how the world really works." She turned around and began walking toward the convent. Alexander took a step to follow her, but Mark Sanders' voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk. There are documents that require your immediate attention." Alexander stood still, watching Emily walk away, feeling as if something essential was being torn from inside him. When he finally turned to face Samantha and the lawyers, there was a coldness in his eyes. That hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. "Let's resolve this quickly," he said. "I want all of you out of here by tomorrow." "Oh, darling," Samantha smiled triumphantly. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, I've brought some interesting documents that you'll want to see, information about your little country girl that might completely change your perspective on this adventure." She gestured to one of the men who brought a leather folder. "Did you know that Emily doesn't have an official surname, that she was left at the convent as a baby with no information about her origin, that the nuns receive an anonymous sum every month to take care of her for more than 20 years? Alexander felt something cold spread through his veins. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about family secrets, my love. Secrets that your late grandfather kept very well." Samantha opened the folder and removed some old documents. "Your little Emily is not as orphaned as she believes." Alexander took the papers with hands that trembled imperceptibly. They were official documents, certificates, and among them, a handwritten letter in calligraphy he recognized immediately, his grandfather's handwriting. As he read, the world around him seemed to silently collapse. The letter spoke of an extramarital affair, of a maid who had become pregnant, of a child who needed to be hidden to avoid scandal. And it specifically mentioned the convent in the town, the monthly payment to ensure the girl would be well cared for, and the express order that she should never know the truth about her origin. Emily was his grandfather's daughter, half-sister to his own father. That made her his aunt. Blackwood blood ran in her veins even though she had never known it. "Impressive, isn't it?" said Samantha, observing his reaction with cruel satisfaction. "Your grandfather was always meticulous in covering his tracks. But when I learned that you had hidden precisely here, I found it interesting to investigate a little more. I imagine this changes your romantic perspectives, doesn't it?" Alexander couldn't fully process what he was reading. The woman he had fallen in love with carried the same blood as him, was part of the family he had always despised, but from which he had never managed to completely free himself. It was as if fate had played the cruelest joke possible on him. "And there's more," continued Samantha, clearly enjoying every word. "If you don't marry me in the next 8 days, not only will you lose the inheritance, I will publicly reveal the truth about Emily." Imagine the scandal. The great Alexander Blackwood in love with his own aunt. The newspapers would have a field day. Alexander raised his eyes from the paper, and Samantha saw something there that made her take an involuntary step back. There was a murderous coldness in that look, a contained anger that promised terrible consequences. "You're blackmailing me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm protecting our mutual interests," she corrected, but the confidence in her voice had diminished slightly. 8 days, Alexander, and then we can forget this little adventure and move on with our lives." Night fell over the town like a heavy cloak, but Alexander couldn't find peace even in the darkness. Samantha and the lawyers had settled in the only inn in the place, their presence like a dark stain on the tranquility he had found there. The documents were still spread on the table in his house, each word a stab that tore not only his feelings, but all the reality he had believed he was building. Emily was blood of his blood. The woman who had awakened in him feelings he thought dead forever carried the Blackwood DNA, was part of the lineage he so despised, but from which he had never managed to free himself. Every moment of tenderness they had shared, every look laden with unspoken promises, every second in which he had considered giving up everything for her, all this had transformed into a cruel parody of fate. But there was something else that tormented him beyond the genetic impossibility of that love. It was the way Emily had looked at him when she learned who he really was, the pain in her eyes when Samantha revealed his lies by omission. He had met her under a false name, had allowed her to believe she was talking to an ordinary man, when in fact he was the direct representative of the power that had destroyed her family even before she was born. Around midnight, unable to stay inside the house any longer, Alexander went out for a walk. His feet led him instinctively toward the convent, but when he got close to the walls he hesitated. What right did he have to seek her out? What words could he use to explain a situation that he himself couldn't fully process? That's when he saw her. Emily was sitting on the stone bench in the garden, still dressed in the same simple dress from the afternoon, but now with a shawl over her shoulders to protect herself from the cold of the early morning. She didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, there was something in her posture that suggested she had been waiting for him. "I knew you would come," she said when Alexander approached, her voice tired but not hostile. "I always knew there were secrets you weren't telling." Alexander stopped a few meters away, respecting the space between them that now seemed charged with a different importance. "Emily, Alexander Blackwood," she interrupted, testing the full name as if it were a foreign word. "I should have suspected. Your manners, your education, the way you talked about the world as if you knew it from above. But I didn't want to see." "Why didn't you want to see?" Emily raised her eyes to him, and Alexander saw in them a pain that cut his heart like a blade. "Because for the first time in my life I felt alive. Because when I was with you, I felt that there was a whole world waiting for me beyond these walls. Because—" her voice failed for a moment. "Because I fell in love with a man who doesn't exist. I do exist, Emily. What I felt for you, what I still feel, that is real." "Is it?" She got up slowly, walking to one of the rose bushes in the garden. "Then explain to me how a man who has billions can be here pretending to be ordinary. Explain to me how someone who is getting married in a week can look at another woman the way you looked at me." Alexander felt the words forming in his throat, the truth struggling to come out even knowing that it might be too late. "I'm here because I ran away from a will that forces me to marry a woman I don't love, because my whole life has been decided by others, and for the first time, I wanted to make a choice that was mine. And when I met you, when you met me, you decided to use this as a last adventure before assuming your responsibilities," she completed, the pain in her voice transforming into something harder. "No!" The denial came out stronger than Alexander intended. "When I met you for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to want to give up everything for someone." Emily observed him for a long moment, as if trying to find the truth behind his words. "But you can't give up, can you? Because men like you never really give up anything. You just take what you want until you get tired. You don't understand the situation I'm in." "Then explain it to me." Emily crossed her arms, a defensive posture that Alexander had never seen in her before. "Tell me about this woman you're going to marry. Tell me about this empire that is more important than anything that might exist between us." Alexander took a deep breath, knowing he needed to be completely honest for the first time since he had met her. He told her about the will, about the clause that forced him to marry in 13 days or lose everything. He talked about Samantha, about her unhealthy obsession with him, about the years of preparation for a wedding that was more a business merger than a union of love. He explained about the family pressures, about the expectations of generations, of Blackwoods who had built their fortune with immoral pacts and calculated alliances. Emily listened in silence, and when he finished, she nodded slowly. "So you really are a victim of your circumstances," she said, but there was irony in her voice. "A powerful man trapped by his own power." "Emily." "But you know what hurts me the most, Alexander?" She approached him, and for the first time, since Samantha arrived, he saw tears in her eyes. "It's not even the fact that you deceived me about who you were. It's the fact that even now, even explaining all this to me, you still haven't said that you'll fight for us. You still haven't said that you'll find a way for us to be together." Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. She was right. Even at that moment, even knowing that he loved her more than he had imagined possible to love someone, A part of him was already calculating the impossibilities, already surrendering to the circumstances. "And if I say I'll fight?" he asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. "Say it and find out." Alexander looked at her face, illuminated only by the faint light of the moon. There was challenge there, but also hope. A fragile hope, but one that still existed despite everything. He took a step forward, further reducing the distance between them. "Emily, I will find a way. I don't know how yet, but—" "No." She shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Don't make me promises you can't keep. Don't give me hope if in the end you're going to abandon me to fulfill your family obligations. Then what do you want from me?" Emily came even closer, so close that Alexander could feel the warmth of her breath. "I want you to choose, now, at this moment, between your world and me, between your inheritance and what you feel for me. Because I can't live in uncertainty, Alexander. I can't wait while you decide if I'm worth the sacrifice." The silence that followed was charged with a tension that seemed to electrify the air between them. Alexander looked at Emily, seeing in her a strength that contrasted with the vulnerability she had shown. She wasn't begging, she was demanding. She wasn't diminishing herself, she was positioning herself as an equal in the decision that would change their lives forever. It was at this moment that he realized how much he had underestimated her. Emily might have been raised in a convent, might not know the complexities of the world beyond those walls, but she possessed an emotional wisdom that he had never developed. She knew that love without courage was just disguised desire. She knew that empty promises were crueler than brutal honesty. "Emily," he said finally, extending his hand to touch her face. But the words were interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze. Footsteps approaching the garden. Alexander instinctively moved away from Emily, and they both looked toward the convent gate, where a figure materialized in the darkness. It was Samantha, accompanied by one of the men she had brought with her. Even in the faint light, her smile was visible, a smile that promised trouble. "What a touching scene," she said, her voice echoing in the silence of the night. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Samantha's presence in the convent garden was like a desecration, her elegant silhouette contrasting violently with the sacred serenity of the place. The man at her side, a burly type that Alexander didn't recognize, but whose icy gaze suggested he wasn't there just to keep her company, positioned himself strategically near the gate, blocking any escape attempt. "Samantha," Alexander kept, his voice controlled, but Emily noticed the tension in his muscles. "What are you doing here?" "Protecting my interests, obviously." She walked slowly through the garden, as if inspecting property she already considered hers. "I knew you would come after your little country girl. Men are so predictable when they believe they're in love." Emily took a step forward, placing herself beside Alexander in a silent demonstration of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by Samantha. "You have no right to be here. This is a sacred place." "Sacred?" Samantha laughed, the sound echoing unpleasantly between the ancient walls. How interesting to hear that from a bastard who doesn't even know who her own father is. Alexander felt Emily stiffen beside him, but she didn't back down. "My origin doesn't define who I am." "Oh, but it does, dear. It defines you completely." Samantha stopped in front of them, her eyes shining with a cruelty that Alexander had never seen before. "Especially when your origin is so intimately linked to the family of the man you fell in love with." Emily frowned, clearly not understanding the insinuation. Alexander felt his blood freeze in his veins, realizing where Samantha wanted to go. She wasn't just going to use the information as blackmail against him, she was going to use it as a weapon to destroy Emily too. "Don't you dare," said Alexander, his voice low but laden with threat. "Don't I dare what? Tell the truth?" Samantha smiled, savoring every second of that moment. "Emily, dear, wouldn't you like to know why your beloved Alexander sometimes seems so familiar? Why you have the strange feeling of having seen those features somewhere else?" "Samantha, I'm warning you." Alexander took a step forward, but the man accompanying Samantha moved too, his hand instinctively going to something under his coat. "You're warning me what?" Samantha laughed again, We're not in your territory anymore, Alexander. Here the rules are different. Emily looked from one to the other, realizing that much more was happening than she could understand. What are you talking about? We're talking about blood, dear Emily. Blackwood blood that runs in your veins without you ever knowing. Samantha took from her purse the same documents she had shown Alexander earlier. We're talking about the fact that your great love is, in fact, your nephew. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily looked at Alexander, searching in his eyes for some denial, some sign that this was just another of Samantha's cruel lies. But what she saw there was confirmation and despair. "No," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Oh yes," Samantha continued, relentless. "You are Alexander's grandfather's daughter, a bastard hidden to avoid scandal, but a Blackwood nonetheless. What you feel for each other isn't love, dear. It's just blood recognizing blood." Emily staggered as if she had taken a physical blow. Alexander extended his hand to support her, but she instinctively moved away, horror stamped on her face. "This can't be true," she said, but her voice betrayed the growing conviction that it was exactly that. "That's why he seemed familiar," continued Samantha cruelly. "That's why you felt so connected. It wasn't destiny, Emily, it was genetics." Alexander couldn't bear to see the pain on Emily's face any longer. "Samantha, enough. You got what you wanted. Now go away." "But I haven't finished yet." Samantha signaled to the man accompanying her, and he approached Emily. "You see, Alexander, there are still 7 days until the final deadline, and I can't risk you doing something crazy driven by misplaced feelings. What are you planning?" Alexander felt an alarm go off in his mind. "I'm ensuring that you'll fulfill your obligations without distractions." Samantha smiled coldly. "Emily will be my guest for a few days, in a place where you can't meet and make choices you'll regret." The man took another step toward Emily, who finally seemed to understand the danger she was in. She looked around, calculating her escape options, but she was surrounded. "You can't kidnap a person like that," said Alexander, anger beginning to overcome shock. "Kidnap is a very strong word," Samantha retorted. "I prefer to think of it as temporary protection. Emily will be very well cared for, I guarantee, and she'll be freed as soon as you say yes at the altar." Emily finally found her voice. "And if I don't want to go?" "Dear, you don't have a choice." Samantha signaled again, and the man moved quickly, grabbing Emily's arm before she could react. "But don't worry. The place where you'll be staying has a lot of meaning for the Blackwood family. You might even discover some interesting truths about your own history." Alexander instinctively advanced to defend Emily, but stopped when he saw the metallic gleam of a weapon in the hand of Samantha's henchman. The message was clear. Any resistance would be met with violence. "Alexander," Emily looked at him over her shoulder as she was forced to walk toward the gate, "don't do what she wants. Not for my sake." "How noble of you," commented Samantha, following behind them. "But I'm afraid Alexander has very little choice in the matter. 7 days, darling. After that, not only will Emily suffer the consequences, but the whole town as well. It would be a pity if something happened to these innocent people, wouldn't it?" Alexander felt a homicidal fury rise up his spine. "If you hurt Emily, or anyone in this town, I swear by everything sacred that—" "That you'll do what?" Samantha laughed, already reaching the gate. "Give up your inheritance and become an ordinary man? Live on love and fresh water with your dear aunt? Oh, Alexander, you've always been smarter than that." They reached the cars, and Emily was forced to enter, the back seat of the middle vehicle. Before the door closed, she looked at Alexander one last time. "Find me," she said, the words almost lost in the sound of engines starting. "Oh, he'll try," said Samantha, entering the first car. "And when he tries, he'll discover some very interesting truths about his own family. Blackwood Manor holds so many secrets." The last comment made Alexander's blood freeze. Blackwood Manor wasn't just a family property. It was the place where his ancestors performed their darkest rituals, where ancient documents were kept like sacred relics, where the family always resolved its most delicate problems. If Samantha had taken Emily there, it wasn't just to keep her away. It was to discover more secrets she could use as weapons. When the cars disappeared around the bend in the road, Alexander remained standing in the convent garden, his mind working furiously. He had 7 days to find Emily, 7 days to discover what other truths Samantha was hiding, and 7 days to make the decision that would define not only his future, but that of all the people he loved. For the first time since he had inherited the Blackwood name, Alexander was truly willing to fight. Not for power, not for tradition, but for something that was infinitely more valuable, the woman he loved, even if that love was forbidden by blood ties he had never chosen. The war against his own family had begun, and he intended to win it no matter the cost. Blackwood Manor rose like a black scar against the grey Vermont sky, its medieval towers cutting through the low clouds that seemed to embrace the building in a somber hug. Emily observed the imposing structure through the car window, feeling a coldness that didn't come just from the air conditioning. There was something deeply disturbing about that place, an energy that seemed to whisper stories of pain and buried secrets. "Welcome to your true home," said Samantha when they got out of the vehicles in the inner courtyard. "Ironic, isn't it? You spent your whole life just a few miles from here, without knowing that this place held all the secrets about your origin." Emily didn't respond, but her eyes scanned the ancient stones, the coats of arms carved into the walls, the stained glass that filtered the light in a strange and melancholic way. There was something familiar about those symbols, in the architectural patterns that seemed to vaguely echo in her memory, as if she had already been there in dreams she couldn't fully remember. They were led through endless corridors, where portraits of Blackwood ancestors observed them with painted eyes that seemed to follow their movements. Emily stopped in front of a particularly imposing portrait, a middle-aged man with aristocratic features and eyes that she recognized immediately. "Ah, you recognized him," observed Samantha, following her gaze. "William Blackwood, the patriarch, your father. You have the same eyes." "As him, you know. It's impossible not to notice when you know where to look." Emily felt her legs weaken, seeing that painted face, recognizing in it features that she saw in the mirror every day, made everything real in a way that Samantha's words hadn't managed to. She really was part of that lineage, carried the blood of men who built empires, on morally questionable foundations. "Come," said Samantha, "there's much more to see." She was led to an isolated tower of the manor, where Emily was installed in a room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a prison. Ancient tapestries covered the walls, period furniture decorated the environment, and a high window offered a view of the extensive gardens that were lost on the horizon. But the bars discreetly worked into the window, and the heavy lock on the door made it clear that this beauty was just a golden cage. "You'll stay here until Alexander comes to his senses," explained Samantha, "but in the meantime, feel free to explore. There's a private library connected to this room that contains fascinating documents about the family history. I'm sure you'll find enlightening readings." When she was alone, Emily slowly explored the space. The room was luxurious, but oppressive, each object seeming to carry the weight of decades of secrets. It was when she opened the door that Samantha had mentioned that her heart raced. The library was a circular room, lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, with documents, books, and scrolls meticulously organized. But what most caught her attention was an antique desk in the center of the room, where some papers were deliberately scattered, as if someone had prepared a staging, expecting her to find them. Emily approached cautiously and saw that they were handwritten letters, some so old that the ink was beginning to fade. The first letter she picked up made her world collapse again. It was written in a delicate feminine calligraphy, and the date indicated 23 years ago. It began with "My dear daughter," and was signed by "Your mother who loves you, Mary." With trembling hands, Emily read every word. Mary told of her forbidden passion for William Blackwood, of how she had fallen in love with her employer when she was just a young maid in the manor. She described the secret meetings in the gardens, the promises whispered in the darkness, the hope that he would leave his wife to be with her. But when the pregnancy was discovered, everything changed. William didn't deny the affair, but made it clear that he would never publicly recognize the child. Mary would be sent away with a sum of money, and the girl would be given to the convent with a false identity. For the world, Mary had died in childbirth, and the child was just another orphan with no past. I wanted you to know the truth one day, the letter said, but I also fear that this truth might hurt you more than protect you. The Blackwoods are powerful, my dear Emily, but they are also prisoners of their own power. Your father could never love me freely because he was taught from childhood that love is weakness. I hope you will be stronger than all of us. Emily felt tears running down her face as she discovered that her mother hadn't died in childbirth, as the nuns had always said. Mary had lived for years keeping that secret, writing letters that Emily had never received, finally dying of an illness that doctors said had been caused by deep sadness. There were other letters, other revelations, documents showing how William Blackwood had manipulated official records to ensure that Emily could never trace him. Monthly payments to the convent that came with specific instructions. The girl should be well cared for, but should never know her true origin. If she ever asked questions, she should be discouraged or even sent elsewhere. But the most disturbing document was at the bottom of the pile. It was William's original will, handwritten years before the official version that Alexander had inherited. And in it, there was a clause that changed everything. I leave my fortune to my grandson Alexander Blackwood, on the condition that he marry within 13 days a woman worthy of our lineage. But if he discovers the true meaning of this trial, which is to renounce power in the name of true love, and if he chooses to love someone whose heart is pure regardless of social status, then the real legacy will be activated, the revelation that our strength has always come not from wealth, but from the ability to love unconditionally. Emily reread the paragraph several times, trying to fully understand its implications. William hadn't created that will as punishment or a test of obedience. He had created it as a spiritual lesson, an opportunity for Alexander to break the cycle of empty ambition that had consumed generations of Blackwood men. But there was more. A handwritten note in the margin, almost illegible with age. The girl in the convent carries our true inheritance, not the money, but the ability to love without conditions. If Alexander finds her and chooses love over power, our family will finally be redeemed. William knew. From the beginning, he knew that Alexander would eventually find Emily, knew that he would fall in love with her despite the blood ties, or perhaps because of them. The old patriarch had orchestrated everything as a final lesson, an opportunity for his grandson to choose love over power, redemption over the perpetuation of empty traditions. Emily sat heavily in the chair, trying to process all those revelations. She wasn't just a hidden bastard. She was part of an elaborate plan devised decades ago by a man who had recognized too late in his own life that he had sacrificed everything that really mattered in the name of an inheritance that in the end was empty. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her rise quickly, hiding the letters inside her dress. Samantha appeared in the doorway with a smile that couldn't completely hide a certain anxiety. "I hope you're feeling at home," she said, her eyes scanning the library as if looking for signs that Emily had discovered something she shouldn't. "Heather, why did you really bring me here?" asked Emily, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "And don't tell me it's just to keep me away from Alexander." Samantha hesitated for a moment, and Emily saw in that instant of uncertainty that there was much more happening than it appeared. The woman who seemed so confident and controlled was, in fact, desperate for something that went beyond simply forcing Alexander to the altar. "Did you discover anything interesting?" asked Samantha, trying to sound casual, but failing completely. Emily kept her expression neutral. "I discovered that my family has a more complicated history than I imagined, but I suspect you already knew that when you brought me here." Samantha's smile failed completely. "You're smarter than you seemed. And you're more desperate than you want to admit." Emily approached, realizing that she had gained some sort of psychological advantage. "The question is, desperate for what?" "Exactly." Alexander spent the first night after Emily's kidnapping walking through the town like a wounded animal, his mind working feverishly to find a way to track her. He knew Samantha well enough to know that she didn't make empty threats, but he also knew that her obsession with him made her predictable in certain aspects. If she had mentioned Blackwood Manor, it wasn't by accident. At dawn, Alexander made the decision that would change everything. He called Mark Sanders, one of the lawyers who had accompanied Samantha, pretending to be ready to surrender to the demands of the will. "Mark," he said when the call was answered, "I need to talk to Samantha. I'm prepared to discuss the terms of the wedding." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Alexander could hear muffled whispers in the background. When Mark returned, his voice was laden with barely disguised satisfaction. "Mr. Blackwood, it's good to know you've come to your senses. Mrs. Rothschild will be very happy to hear you. She is taking care of some family matters at the manor, but I'm sure she can receive you there." Alexander smiled coldly. As predicted, Samantha couldn't resist the temptation to indirectly boast about where she was keeping Emily. "I'll be there in 3 hours." But Alexander wasn't planning to surrender. During the 2 weeks in town, he had made connections that Samantha could never imagine. The elderly caretaker, Joseph, who had been looking after the property for decades, had a nephew who worked as security for elite companies. A few discreet phone calls revealed valuable information about the men Samantha had hired, and more importantly, about the weak points in the manor's security system. The trip to Vermont was charged with a tension different from anything Alexander had ever felt. He was no longer the reluctant heir running from his responsibilities. He was a man willing to do anything to save the woman he loved, even knowing that this love was genetically impossible. He arrived at the manor when the sun was in the middle of the sky, the imposing medieval structure looking even more somber under the harsh light of day. The gates opened automatically, as if he were expected, and Alexander drove slowly along the stone path to the main courtyard. Samantha was waiting for him on the main staircase, dressed in an elegant white ensemble that dramatically contrasted with the dark architecture of the manor. Her smile was triumphant, but Alexander noticed a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Alexander, darling," she said when he got out of the car, "how good of you to decide to be reasonable." "Where is Emily?" was his first question, dispensing with any social protocol. "Safe and well cared for, I assure you. But first, let's talk about our arrangements." Samantha descended the stairs gracefully, but maintained enough distance for the 2 security guards discreetly positioned on the sides to intervene if necessary. Alexander followed her into the manor, his eyes scanning every architectural detail as childhood memories came flooding back. He had visited the manor a few times as a child, always on formal occasions, where adults spoke in low voices about business that he didn't fully understand. Now, understanding better the nature of the family business, the place seemed even more sinister. They were led to the main hall where documents were already spread out on a mahogany table. Marriage contracts, powers of attorney, papers that would officially transfer all control of the inheritance to Alexander as soon as he said yes at the altar. "As you can see," said Samantha, pointing to the documents, "everything is prepared. The wedding will take place in 5 days at the cathedral in New York. The guest list includes all the important people we need to impress." Alexander pretended to examine the papers, but his mind was focused on memorizing the layout of the manor, identifying escape routes and calculating how many men Samantha had brought with her. From what he could observe, there were at least 6 security guards scattered throughout the property. "And Emily?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Emily is discovering fascinating truths about her family," replied Samantha, with a venomous smile. "I imagine the revelations have been enlightening for her." Alexander felt a pang of concern. Samantha was clearly enjoying some knowledge that he didn't possess. "What kind of truths?" "Oh, you'll find out soon. But first, I need you to sign these documents confirming your commitment to the wedding." While pretending to read the contracts, Alexander discreetly observed his surroundings. The hall had 3 exits, the main one through which they had entered, a side one that probably led to the kitchens, and a spiral staircase that went up to the towers. If Emily was being held in the manor, the towers would be the most likely location. "There's something that intrigues me, Samantha," said Alexander, raising his eyes from the papers. "Why all this elaborate theater? If you wanted to force the marriage, there would be much simpler ways." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the fact that you're so desperate to marry me that you brought Emily to the exact place where she could discover the truth about her origin. Alexander slowly stood up, observing how Samantha instinctively tensed. The question is, what else are you trying to hide? I'm not hiding anything. The response came out louder than she intended, confirming Alexander's suspicions. No? He walked slowly around the table, forcing Samantha to turn to follow him. Then why specifically choose the manor? Why leave historical documents within Emily's reach? Why all this staging if you just wanted to blackmail me? Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sound that made Alexander's heart race. Screams coming from somewhere in the upper towers. They weren't screams of fear. They were screams of anger, of someone fighting. Emily, he murmured, already moving toward the staircase. Stop, ordered Samantha, but Alexander was already running. The security guards tried to intercept him, but Alexander had grown up in that manor and knew every corridor, every secret passage. He dodged the first man, pushed the second against a wall, and climbed the staircase 3 steps at a time. The screams grew louder as he climbed, and Alexander recognized not only Emily's voice but also that of other men. When he finally reached the corridor of the East Tower, he saw a scene that made his blood boil. Emily being dragged by 2 men toward a staircase that led to the higher levels of the tower. "Let her go!" shouted Alexander, advancing without. Thinking of the consequences. Emily saw him and her eyes shone with a mixture of relief and despair. "Alexander, they found the letters. Samantha doesn't just want to force our marriage, she's trying to hide something about the original will." Before Alexander could fully process the information, one of the men drew a weapon. The situation had escalated to a level of violence that he wasn't prepared to face unarmed. "Stop where you are, Mr. Blackwood," said the man, the weapon pointed directly at Alexander. "Mrs. Rothschild wants to talk to you, and your friend here will ensure that you're reasonable." Alexander slowly raised his hands, but his eyes didn't leave Emily. Even in that desperate situation, she maintained a dignity and strength that impressed him. There was something different about her too, a determination that wasn't there when she was kidnapped, as if the discoveries she had made in the manor had awakened a part of her personality that had remained dormant. "All right," said Alexander, his voice controlled. "Let's talk, but Emily comes with me." "I'm afraid that's not possible," said a new voice. Samantha had come up behind him, accompanied by 2 more security guards. "You see, Emily has discovered some information that could complicate our plans, information that I would prefer remained secret." Alexander looked from Samantha to Emily, trying to understand exactly what had been discovered. But one thing was clear. The situation had become much more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "What information?" he asked. "Let's just say that your dear grandfather was more creative in his wills than anyone imagined." Samantha smiled, but there was a poorly controlled hysteria behind the expression. "And certain people might not be happy to know that there are secret clauses that could completely invalidate our inheritance." Alexander felt something cold spread through his veins. If there were secret clauses in the will, if Samantha was desperate to hide them, then perhaps there was still a way out of that situation, without sacrificing either Emily or his own freedom. The question was, how much time would they have before Samantha decided they knew too much to remain alive? The tension in the tower corridor was palpable when Samantha ordered everyone to go down to the main hall. Alexander stayed close to Emily as they were escorted by the armed men, noticing how she walked with a determination that contrasted with the dangerous situation they were in. There was something in her hands, folded papers she was trying to hide under her dress. In the hall, Samantha dismissed most of the security guards, keeping only 2 near the exits. Her confidence had returned, but Alexander noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she served herself wine. "Well," she said, trying to regain control of the situation, "now that we're all gathered, we can resolve this misunderstanding in a civilized manner." "What misunderstanding?" asked Alexander, instinctively positioning himself between Samantha and Emily. "The misunderstanding that you have any choice in the matter." Samantha walked to the large window that overlooked the gardens. Emily discovered some interesting documents in the library, but I'm afraid she didn't fully understand the implications of what she read. Emily took a step forward, surprising both Alexander and Samantha with her courage. I understood perfectly. William Blackwood never intended to force Alexander into an arranged marriage. He created a test to see if his grandson would be capable of choosing true love over power. Ah, Samantha laughed, but the sound was laden with desperation. And you believe that changes anything? It changes everything. Emily removed the hidden papers and extended them to Alexander. The original will establishes that the real inheritance is not the money or the properties. It's the liberation of the family from generations of greed and empty ambition. Alexander took the documents with hands he couldn't completely control. He read quickly, but each word seemed to rewrite his entire understanding of his grandfather and of the situation itself. "This can't be real," he murmured. "It's completely real," confirmed Emily. William discovered, too late in his own life, that he had sacrificed his ability to love in the name of power. When he got involved with my mother, it was the first time he felt something genuine, but it was already too late to completely change his life. "So he created this test as a form of redemption," she continued, looking directly at Alexander. "If you chose love over the traditional inheritance, you would prove that our family could be redeemed. The secret clause establishes that in that case all assets would be converted into charitable foundations, freeing you to live your own life." "What a touching story," interrupted Samantha, her voice icy. "But you forget one important detail. I need this marriage. My family made investments based on the guarantee that I would become a Blackwood. If that doesn't happen—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Alexander understood. The Rothschilds had bet everything on the alliance with his family. If the wedding didn't take place, they wouldn't just lose social status, they would probably face financial ruin. "So that's it," said Alexander slowly. "You're not in love with me. You're desperate to save your own family from bankruptcy. Love is a luxury that people like us can't afford," replied Samantha. But there was a break in her voice that revealed years of repressed feelings. "I learned to love you because I needed to. And now, I need you to love me back." Emily looked at Samantha with an expression that mixed pity and understanding. "You can't force someone to love, Samantha, and even if you could, it would only be an imitation of the real feeling." "And what do you know about real feelings?" Samantha turned to Emily with renewed anger. "You're a bastard raised by nuns who fell in love with her own nephew. You think that's true love?" The silence that followed was charged with a pain that everyone in the hall could feel. Alexander looked at Emily, seeing in her eyes the conflict that he himself carried. How to define what they felt for each other, knowing of the blood ties that connected them. It was Emily who broke the silence. "Maybe it's not love in the traditional sense," she said, her voice low but firm. "Maybe it's something more complex, recognition, spiritual connection, the attraction of souls that share the same origin. But even if it's just that, it's more real than anything based on obligation or desperation." Alexander felt something unravel inside him. Throughout his life, he had been taught to question and control his feelings, to evaluate them in terms of social advantage. But Emily was right. What existed between them transcended conventional definitions. "Samantha," he said, turning to face her, "you can force me to the altar. You can blackmail me, threaten me, even drug me if necessary, but you can't force me to feel for you what I feel for Emily." "So you're willing to lose everything?" Samantha asked, incredulity and desperation fighting in her voice. "I'm willing to gain everything," corrected Alexander. "For the first time in my life, I'm willing to choose what really matters." Samantha looked from one to the other, realizing she was losing control of the situation. It was then that she made the most dangerous decision of all. "If I can't have you," she said, her voice taking on an icy tone that made Alexander shiver, "then I guarantee that no one else will." She signaled to the security guards, and Alexander saw weapons being drawn. The situation had escalated to a point of no return. "Samantha, don't do this," said Emily, taking a step forward with a courage that surprised all those present. "You can still choose a different path." "There is no different path for me," replied Samantha, but tears were beginning to form in her eyes. "You don't understand. If I go home without this marriage, my family will be destroyed. People who depend on us will lose everything, and I will have nothing." It was at this moment that Alexander fully understood the tragedy of the situation. Samantha wasn't just an obsessed villain. She was a woman as much a prisoner of her own family system as he had been. The difference was that he had Emily to show him that alternatives existed, while Samantha only saw the abyss. "There is a third option," he said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "What option?" "The charitable foundations mentioned in the original will. They will need competent administrators, people who understand the practical aspects of business, but who have also learned the value of redemption." Samantha looked at him with distrust. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering purpose," corrected Alexander. "A chance to use your skills for something that really matters, and a way for your family to maintain dignity while building something new." Emily looked at Alexander with growing admiration. Even in that extreme situation, he was trying to find a solution that would save everyone, including the woman who had put them in danger. Samantha was silent for a long moment, processing the offer. Slowly, she signaled for the security guards to lower their weapons. "And if I accept," she said finally, "what happens to you two?" Alexander looked at Emily, seeing in her a strength and wisdom that went far beyond her 22 years. "We discover together what it means to be free to choose our own destiny. Even knowing that you are—" Samantha couldn't finish the sentence. "Even knowing that our story is more complicated than most," completed Emily. "Sometimes true love doesn't come in the forms we expect, but that doesn't make it less real." As the sun began to set through the windows of the manor, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced along the ancient walls, a new story began to be written. It wouldn't be a simple or conventionally happy story, but it would be genuine in a way that generations of Blackwoods had never known. 3 months later, the ruins of the burned church in the New England town witnessed something that hadn't happened in centuries, a ritual of love that transcended all social and family conventions. Alexander and Emily walked among the moss-covered stones and vines, carrying candles that flickered in the night breeze of an approaching storm. It wasn't a marriage in the traditional sense. How could they officially marry now knowing their true family connection? But it was something deeper, a commitment of soul made before the ruins of generations that had sacrificed love for power, a vow that their story would be different. Samantha had left 2 weeks after the events at the manor, accepting the position of executive director of the new Blackwood Foundations. Before leaving, she had a final conversation with Alexander that neither of them would ever forget. "You know you'll never be able to have a normal life," she had said, without malice now, just a genuine sadness. "The world doesn't understand. Love's like yours. Then we'll create our own world," had been his response. And that was exactly what they were doing. Alexander had officially renounced the traditional inheritance, activating the secret clauses of the will. The fortune was converted into charitable foundations that would work on historical restoration projects, education for underprivileged communities, and environmental preservation. He kept only enough to buy a small property in the town, where they could live simply but with dignity. Emily had left the convent not to flee from her faith, but to discover a broader spirituality. The nuns, initially shocked by the revelations about her origin, eventually understood that she needed to find her own path. Mother Superior had blessed her departure with words that still echoed in her mind. "God sometimes writes stories that don't fit in our rule books." Now, walking among the ruins under a sky heavy with clouds, they reached the improvised altar they had created, an ancient stone table where they placed Mary's letters, the pages of William's original will, and a framed photo of the only image that existed of the two of them together, taken by chance during one of their walks through the town. "Are you sure?" asked Alexander when they stopped before the altar, his voice competing with the sound of distant thunder. Emily smiled, the same smile that had won his heart months ago, but now laden with a wisdom and determination that adversity had forged. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. The first drops of rain began to fall when Alexander took her hands. Then, before these stones that have seen generations of loves sacrificed for power, I promise you, Emily, that our love will be different. I promise that I will choose you every day, not because I'm obligated by law or tradition, but because you awakened in me a humanity that I thought I had lost forever. Emily felt tears mix with the rain on her face. And I promise you, Alexander, that I will love not just the man you are, but also the man you are becoming. I promise that our connection, whether it's called love, spiritual recognition, or something that doesn't yet have a name, will be cultivated with the reverence it deserves. The storm intensified around them, but neither of them moved to seek shelter. There was something purifying about that rain, as if it were washing away the sins of past generations and offering a new beginning. Alexander took from his pocket 2 simple silver rings, without precious stones or elaborate inscriptions. They were rings that he himself had forged in the workshop of a local artisan, learning a manual skill he had never imagined he possessed. He placed one on Emily's finger and offered the other for her to place on his. "We are not husband and wife in the eyes of the world," he said, needing to raise his voice to be heard above the storm, "but we are soul companions in the eyes of any divine force that may be witnessing this moment. And that is more sacred than any ceremony in a cathedral," replied Emily, sealing the ring on his finger with a gentle kiss. It was then, under the pouring rain, surrounded by the ruins of a past that had finally been redeemed, that they kissed. For the first time. It wasn't a kiss of unbridled passion, but something deeper, a recognition, an acceptance, a promise that they would face together all the complexities of their unique situation. When they finally separated, both were soaked, but they laughed like children. Alexander picked Emily up in his arms and spun with her among the ruins, and for a moment, they were just 2 human beings celebrating the discovery that true love can exist even in the most unlikely circumstances. In the months that followed, they built a life that defied all conventions. Alexander learned to work with his hands, restoring old houses in the town, and discovering a satisfaction in physical work that he had never experienced in meeting rooms. Emily established a medicinal garden that provided herbs for the entire region, combining the knowledge she had learned in the convent with research on native plants. They faced judgments, whispers, and curious looks from occasional visitors who recognized the Blackwood name. But the local community, which had witnessed their transformation and their genuine commitment to the town, welcomed them as part of the chosen family they had created. That night, when they lay in the simple bed of their restored stone house, Emily sometimes wrote in a journal she had kept since the discovery of her true origin. The last pages contained reflections that she would never share with anyone but Alexander. "We discovered that true love doesn't always conform to society's expectations. Sometimes it emerges in forms that defy biology, law, and tradition. But when it is genuine, when it is built on mutual respect, joint growth, and the daily choice to prioritize each other's well-being, it becomes a force that can redeem generations of mistakes." Alexander, reading over her shoulder on one of those nights, added his own reflection. "My grandfather thought he was testing us with his complex will. But now I understand that he was offering us a chance at liberation, not just from a material inheritance, but from family patterns that had imprisoned our lineage for centuries." A year later, when the Blackwood Foundations had already funded the restoration of 3 historic churches and built 2 schools in underprivileged communities, Samantha made an unexpected visit to the town. She arrived driving a simple car, wearing practical clothes, a transformation that surprised both Alexander and Emily. "I came to thank you," she said during dinner at their house, her voice carrying a peace that didn't exist during the traumatic events at the manor. "Not just for the work, but for showing me that there are forms of strength that don't involve domination." She told them about the projects she was developing, about how she had discovered satisfaction in using her administrative skills for causes that really mattered, about the simple and gentle man she had met during a visit to an orphanage in Maine, a teacher who made her laugh and who didn't know or care about her connection to the Blackwoods. "You saved me from myself," she confessed before leaving. And I hope you have found a form of happiness that is truly your own. That night, Alexander and Emily walked again to the ruins of the burned church, now partially restored as part of the foundation's projects. The structure was being rebuilt, not as a symbol of religious power, but as a community center where people of all ages could gather. "Do you regret anything?" asked Emily, as they watched the stars through the openings in the roof under construction. Alexander thought for a long moment before answering. "I regret not having known my true mother, having wasted so much time pretending to be someone I wasn't, having caused pain to people who didn't deserve it. But I don't regret a single day since I met you. Even knowing that our story will never be completely understood by others." "Especially because of that," he answered, pulling her closer, "because it means it's genuinely ours. It wasn't decided by social conventions or family pressures. It was consciously chosen, day after day, by two people who decided that true love is worth any sacrifice." Emily nestled in his arms, feeling the deep peace that only came when one is exactly where one should be. "Then let's continue choosing," she murmured, "every day, for the rest of our lives." And so, under a starry sky in the small New England, town where everything began, two hearts that society would consider impossible to unite found a form of love that transcended all conventional definitions. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, but it was real in a way that generations of their ancestors had never experienced. It was, finally, the redemption that William